Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Erica Peirson of the Peirson Center for Children, and I want to present to you some information that I often use in my practice when I'm helping the children that I work with in optimizing their glucose metabolism to support their healthy brain development. So today I'll be including these topics. Of course, the glucose metabolism. Will be going into some biochemistry here, talking about the importance of mitochondria, of course, and its role in glucose metabolism, and then brain energy requirements and the role that energy plays in brain development. And then, of course, mitochondrial dysfunction. How do we make that diagnosis, and how do we treat when we determine that mitochondrial dysfunction is present in our patients? So, to start off with glucose, for lay people who are listening to this, I hope some practitioners listen to this as well. Glucose, when we're talking about it, we're not just talking about sweets, cookies, soda, and candies and things. We're also talking, of course, about whole grains, rice, oats, corn, barley. Of course, they all contain fairly large amounts of glucose in grains. But fruits and vegetables, even something like kale and broccoli, they also contain glucose. And then naturally, of course, root vegetables contain glucose. So we're not just talking about issues with sweets here. Usually with the whole grains, particularly, they will come with the B vitamins that are necessary to metabolize the glucose within them. But I'll talk about what can deplete those B vitamins when we're not eating the whole grains and just eating the sweets. So this is the structure of glucose, right? It is a ring of carbon and with these hydroxyl groups on it, carbohydrate. It was originally named because they thought it was hydrated carbon, and that's actually not the case. It was named before they knew the actual structure of it. On the left here, we see the same ring structure in what we call the chair formation. And I wanted to show you this formation because it's used in the next image. If you see on the right there, that's glucose in the chair formation in the ring. And glucose, as you see here, is also found in wood. And I wanted to bring in this analogy because this is really important and relevant to how we ourselves in our body gain energy from glucose. When we burn wood, right, we're basically harvesting that energy from the electrons contained within the glucose, just as our bodies do. And so this is literally what we call it in our, basic biology classes. I used to teach cell biology, and we call it the harvesting of electrons. And so that's how we gain glucose. Gain energy from glucose is from the electrons from it. And of course, when we're burning wood, those electrons are being released very quickly with lots of energy. I mean, so much energy, right? You can imagine, in a campfire and things, there's a lot of energy there. Now, in humans and all other animals, of course, the harvesting of electrons from glucose is much more tightly controlled, right? So that we don't sort of spontaneously combust. And the process is conducted through a series of enzymes, many, many enzymes, and a series of steps that starts with glycolysis, right? So in that little image there, you do see a molecule of glucose, if you can kind of picture that ring structure again. And glucose is divided through a 10-step process to two molecules of what's called pyruvate. And I want you to remember that because pyruvate or pyruvic acid here is going to be very important. I'm going to mention it a few times. And this steps, of course, requires magnesium. I'll show you that in a couple of slides later. The next step in cellular respiration is, the full process of how we get energy from glucose. The next step is the citric acid cycle. So this occurs within the mitochondria. Glycolysis occurs outside of the mitochondria. And this absolutely requires oxygen. If oxygen is not present, the citric acid cycle shuts down and this doesn't occur. And then that glycolysis is switched over to, lactic acid fermentation, and there are other things that can do that. But oxygen is absolutely essential, of course. And the citric acid cycle starts with the pyruvate dehydrogenase enzyme complex, which again, I'll get into in a little bit, and it absolutely requires B vitamins. The last step of the cellular respiration of getting this energy is through the electron transport chain. This is also located within the mitochondria. This is a significant source of oxidative stress because electrons are carried from one enzyme complex to the other, and they can sort of be dropped. And when free floating electrons are dropped, they can create free radicals. Oxygen will pick them up and create something called a reactive oxygen species, which is, a damaging free radical. So, of course, this requires the electron transport chain CoQ10, riboflavin, and niacin as well. And I'll show you that on our next couple of slides. But I want to pause here again for any lay people watching this, that when I'm talking about enzymes that are used for this process, enzymes are the sort of the hands or the tools that are converting one compound to the next. And in, for example, the citric acid cycle, when one compound is converted to the next, that's when energy is released. And so really important to these enzymes are these cofactors. Enzymes don't work without cofactors. And that's how vitamins work in the body. Vitamins act as enzyme cofactors. So vitamins and enzymes, they go together. And in the absence of specific vitamin cofactors, right, those enzymes won't work. And so vitamin deficiencies stem really from the root of that is from poorly functioning enzymes. And I want to emphasize that because things like glycolysis, right? Remember, the first step of obtaining energy from glucose is glycolysis outside of the mitochondria, requires all of these enzymes. 10 steps, 10 enzymes. 6 of those 10 require magnesium as a cofactor. So magnesium is really important for gaining energy from glucose. And there are ways of assessing magnesium in our patients. A red blood cell magnesium is much more accurate assessment of the body's magnesium status than just a serum level, because most magnesium is obtained within our cells. So doing a red blood cell magnesium level is going to be really important. And an optimal red blood cell magnesium level is somewhere around 6 milligrams per deciliter, I believe it is. So really important for magnesium levels to be optimal here. And then I'll talk about sources of magnesium later in treatment. So the citric acid cycle is sort of the next step. So if you recall what I just said about glycolysis, breaking apart glucose into 2 pyruvate molecules, you can see on the top of the image here, you see pyruvate. So this is where pyruvate, again, still outside of the mitochondria, is shuttled within the mitochondria and then converted to acetyl-CoA. And I'm going to pause on this step here a little bit. If you can see that little faint PD, I'm going to talk about that on the next slide. So I just want to highlight that first step is really important for making acetyl-CoA. And then, of course, you can see there that acetyl-CoA is needed for the production of acetylcholine. Of course, bringing in choline, also an important supplement, and dietary sources of choline are important as well. But acetylcholine, of course, is very important for muscle tone, gut motility, brain function. So the citric acid cycle is involved here. And what I again want to highlight here is all those orange highlighted B vitamins all over the citric acid cycle. These are the cofactors for these enzymes that make this process work. So really important. And then, of course, you see there the hint of that electron transport chain, of course, needing B vitamins as well. And the ultimate product of energy production in the body is ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So here's, again, that first step, right? And on the top of the previous slide, pyruvate dehydrogenase. This is an enzyme complex. It's quite large, and it links glycolysis with the citric acid cycle. And it literally passes pyruvate into the mitochondria via this enzyme. And so the cofactors for this enzyme, really important. And if these vitamin cofactors are not present or at insufficient levels in the body, this key to the front door, the very first step of mitochondrial function and citric acid cycle, doesn't work. So those cofactors are vitamin B1, B2, and alpha lipoic acid. There are 3 subunits of this enzyme, subunit E1, E2, and E3. Subunit E1 is dependent on vitamin B1. E3 is dependent on B2, and then alpha lipoic acid is the cofactor for subunit E2 of this enzyme. So really important step, and one that I wanted to highlight. And so here we have the electron transport chain, sort of the last step of mitochondrial function. And it requires, yes, CoQ10, vitamin B2, and vitamin B3. And as you saw those arrows, the first two on the left there pointing to NADH. From NAD, that's vitamin B3. FADH2 from FAD, that's vitamin B2, that's riboflavin. And then that top arrow pointing to the Q, that's CoQ10, which is the electron carrier from complex 1 to complex 2 within the inner mitochondrial membrane. And so without going into too much detail here, these enzymes shuttle electrons through that you can see there in those orange kind of yellowy bursts there. And when those electrons are moved through, we create this concentration gradient of hydrogen, and then that concentration gradient is used to make ATP from that large blue ATP synthase enzyme at the end there. So the really important thing here are these cofactors, right? Again, if any of these nutrients are low in the body, then again, this process will not work efficiently. So this is a summary of cellular respiration. We see glycolysis. There's your O2, your oxygen. Your glucose molecule is that hexagonal shape there, that turquoise hexagon. And you can see it's converting into 2 pyruvate molecules. And we do get a little bit of ATP. We get 2 molecules of ATP. And then do you see how pyruvate then is moving across the membrane to acetyl-CoA? And that's where pyruvate dehydrogenase complex sits. Citric acid cycle, 2 molecules of ATP. But then at the very end there, that electron transport chain that you see in the inner membrane of the mitochondria, producing all those orange ATP, 32 to 34 ATP varying depending on the efficiency of that electron transport chain. So just a summary of what I said here that we all learn in our basic biochemistry classes. So the end product, right, of course, that ATP synthase, that large blue enzyme I showed you on the end of the electron transport chain, is the end product of cellular respiration. And this ATP carrying those high energy bonds of phosphate on the end of it there, they're all negative. They're holding a lot of energy in between them in order to just, stay next to each other. And those phosphate groups are released when energy is needed for various processes within the body. Everything within the body uses this ATP for energy. So we're going from glucose to ATP, multiple steps, multiple enzymes, multiple cofactors. So how is this relevant to brain energy requirements? The brain consumes the most energy per unit weight of all organs in the human body. It's very energetically, very high metabolic rate in the brain. It's constantly working, constantly clearing out things, even when we sleep, right? Hopefully you have some dreams sometimes, and that's a sign that your brain is still processing while we sleep. And in adults, 20 to 25% of total energy expenditure is used by the brain. But in children, that's even higher, as much as 44 up to 87% in children. I have the citation for this on the next slide. So very high energy requirements for brain in children. They need glucose in their diet in healthy forms, and they need adequate amounts of the B vitamins and magnesium and other cofactors in order to metabolize that energy. So the peak age is 4 to 5 years old. This is when children, all through early development, their brain is just, they're learning so fast and so much. And really around 4 to 5 years old is where it peaks. I'll show you on this next slide. So this was a great paper. I read it, word for word multiple times. Metabolic costs and evolutionary implications of human brain development. So what kind of energy requirements are there within the brain at various ages? So in these graphs, you see on the x-axis, you see 0 through 15 is the age. And you can see the peak in brain glucose uptake, again, around 4 to 5 years old. And I think what's also interesting with these is that you see it's a little bit higher on the bottom slides. The solid line is males and the dashed line is females. So it's even higher in males. And I think that's kind of curious. I'll be talking in a few slides later the relevance of this to our patients with autism. And we do see a higher rate of autism in boys. And they do, maybe not coincidentally, have a higher rate of glucose energy requirements within their brain. So how does how does the brain use energy? Membrane depolarization and repolarization. This is how impulses get transmitted through the brain. This is how neurons work, essentially. Neurotransmitter release and then reuptake. So when we release glutamate, for example, we want to very quickly be able to reuptake it so that it doesn't cause a glutamate storm or issues. So really that really tight control of neurotransmitters within the synapse of our neurons is controlled with energy. And then again, ion pumping, again, really important for nervous impulses within the brain. And so there are other things that energy is used for, but these are, some important ones. I mean, the brain is just highly, highly metabolic. So what evidence do we have of this mitochondrial dysfunction in our patients with autism spectrum disorder, ASD? This was an excellent paper published in July of 2024 by Dr. Richard Fry and Dr. Dan Rossignol. I think I've heard them say this took them maybe a couple of years to write even. And this is a meta-analysis. We love meta-analyses because they look at all the research for us and then publish it. They looked at 204 relevant articles looking at biomarkers of mitochondrial dysfunction. And I want to highlight that overall in these papers, they came up with a 41% elevation in pyruvate in children with autism. And so, again, recall that my highlighting and emphasis of that pyruvate. If pyruvate is not shuttled into the mitochondria and that pyruvate dehydrogenase enzyme is not functioning optimally, pyruvate will be elevated. It will kind of hang out in the blood. We'll find it in the urine, and it'll be found in higher levels as they've discovered in many of their papers. Here's an example of a paper on the right here that from 2014. Again, majority of children with autism had higher plasma pyruvate levels than the controls. So, and we find this in multiple papers. This is a paper, actually, another really good one, the role of thiamine in autism. So remember that pyruvate dehydrogenase enzyme complex has the cofactors B1, B2, and alpha lipoic acid. B1 is, I would say, particularly important. The subunit E1 of the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex is quite large. There are more of them on the enzyme, and so thiamine is particularly important, but B2 is also important, riboflavin. So a relationship between thiamine status and the development of autism has been established, with thiamine supplementation exhibiting a beneficial clinical effect on children with autism. Now, when I get into treatment, I'll talk about doses here. We'll talk about really briefly why thiamine deficiency would occur in a child with autism, or any child, or any of us can experience, these deficiencies for various reasons. So what signs and symptoms are we looking for? We're looking for low muscle tone, right? This is due to, of course, low ATP levels, just the muscles just not having energy to maintain that tone. And of course, tone is different than strength. Tone is where the muscles are at when they're at rest, the amount of contraction when they're at rest. And then it's also due to low acetylcholine levels. And again, remember early on when I showed you the citric acid cycle, pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, and acetyl-CoA needed for acetylcholine synthesis. So ultimately, our acetylcholine synthesis, which is needed for muscle tone, gut motility, and brain health, ultimately comes from our ability to metabolize glucose efficiently. Other symptoms, of course, constipation. Acetylcholine is needed for gut motility. Fatigue. And don't forget, fatigue in children can look very different than fatigue in adult. It can present as hyperactivity, irritability, poor focus. A lot of our kids with ADHD are really exhausted, actually. They're not hyper. They don't have too much energy. They're actually exhausted, on a cellular level for sure. Heat and cold intolerance, just difficulty regulating body temperature. We have some others here. Immune system dysfunction. I spoke at the fall MAPS conference of this year, just a couple months ago, on immunometabolism, and the whole topic of the immune system being very dependent on our metabolic rate, because the immune system is very metabolically active, especially when we're sick and fighting acute and chronic infections. And marginal deficiency in things like thiamine during an acute infection can quickly drop somebody into a thiamine deficient state, and then lots of neurological issues can result secondary to that. We'll see neuropathies in mitochondrial dysfunction, often secondary to these B vitamin deficiencies. I'm often looking for a wrist drop in my patients. What's the posture of their hands when they're walking or just in a relaxed state? We'll see elevated liver enzymes because, again, liver cells just not getting the energy they need, and they will undergo apoptosis and release their enzymes that are inside of them. And then we see those elevated enzymes in the blood. We'll see migraines. Of course, this can be related to many things, but certainly glutamate. Again, remember that important process of neurotransmitter control within the brain needing energy. Reuptake needing energy. So why would these nutrient deficiencies occur? And nutrient deficiencies, your vitamin B1, your B2, and many others, minerals, B12, sometimes full, amino acid deficiencies. Why would they occur in any child with low muscle tone, regardless of their genetics? So if we start in the lower right-hand corner and we look at slow gut motility, that's where I want to start with this image. Low muscle tone will translate to slow gut motility, because the gut, at the end of the day, from tongue to anus, is muscular, very muscular organ. In the stomach and the intestines, we have 3 layers of muscles that are all kind of 90 degree from one another, churning and moving our food through our gut. So any stagnation in gut motility that may or may not even be visible, if a child can be having a bowel movement every day, maybe they have bloating, maybe they don't have bloating, if there's reflux, right? All these are signs of slow gut motility. Again, may or may not even be present. If they have low muscle tone in their skeletal nervous system, I'm still suspicious of some GI stagnation. This will result in SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, candida overgrowth, especially in the presence of lots of antibiotics for that child. And then when those things set in the small intestine, when we get too much yeast and bacteria trapped in the small intestine, will absolutely result in malabsorption. Toxic byproducts, yeast will create things like aldehydes. Aldehydes are very toxic for the body, and specifically will result aldehydes in a thiamine deficiency. But that malabsorption, that can be different for every child, different degree of it, different nutrients are absorbed differently. And so this is where we want to test. Are there any nutrient deficiencies in this child? And what are they specific to that child? Because those nutrient deficiencies will result in more low muscle tone, which I've linked here to nervous system dysfunction, but also mitochondrial dysfunction, more slow gut motility, and vicious cycle. So this is a really important concept that I use in a lot of what I do to help my patients. And then, of course, assessing gut microbiome and all of that is a whole nother topic unto itself. So how do we diagnose mitochondrial dysfunction? There are certain tests. The organic acid test, I put that in all caps. I'm going to talk about that in the next few slides. Really important test that I believe that any child with any neurodevelopmental condition, concern, delay, diagnosis should receive an organic acid test in order to gain an understanding of where specifically within their mitochondria do they need support. We can do a blood carnitine level, but we'll see markers in the organic acid test that will indicate a need for carnitine. I do a serum B12. I don't do other blood levels of B vitamins. They're often not accurate just looking at them in the blood. We want to look at cellular function to see how they're being used. And that's where the organic acid comes into play. Again, a red blood cell magnesium being very important here. Oh, and I want to pause. A serum B12, really important here. is to make sure that we are not following lab reference ranges. We want an optimal B12 level. Lab reference ranges are also often capturing undiagnosed pathology in the people they are using for those reference ranges. So an optimal B12 level is somewhere around, definitely not below 500 or 550, because there are papers that have shown that it can be undetectable in the central nervous system at those levels in the blood. So I like to see my patients at 800 to 1200 picograms per ml of serum B12. Red blood cell magnesium level, of course, I mentioned earlier, should be as close to 6 milligrams per deciliter as you can. I want to do a thorough assessment of thyroid. Again, that's a whole nother lecture unto itself, but we want to do thorough. We want to look at TSH, free T4, free T3, and reverse T3, because children with malabsorption and nutrient deficiencies, chronic health issues, can have an elevated reverse T3 that will not be seen if you just do TSH and free T4. We'll look at a comprehensive metabolic panel for liver enzymes, electrolytes, etc. And then, of course, as thorough of a physical exam as you can do to assess the muscle tone, gut health. I look at eyes to assess cranial nerves. I look at tongue movement to assess cranial nerves. Again, assessing their hands. Many things to look at here. So an organic acid test. This is, again, a very important test. It's a urine test. For some children, that's simple to obtain. For other children, that can be challenging to get urine parameters that they want you to collect this urine sample. But basically what happens when there is a block in an enzyme, and remember what can block an enzyme is a vitamin deficiency. Compound A will build up in the urine like pyruvate. Perfect example is pyruvate, because pyruvate is not being converted to compound B, which is acetyl-CoA. And when that compound builds up in the blood, we can very accurately extrapolate that enzyme is blocked, typically due to a vitamin deficiency. Yeah. So this is an example of an organic acid test result. I think I have another one coming up in a case at the end here. And we can literally specifically see here, you see, hopefully you recognize some of this now. You see carbohydrates going to pyruvic acid, acetyl-CoA going into the citric acid cycle. And I can see through an organic acid test when any of these intermediates of the citric acid cycle are elevated, like here in this example is succinic acid. We know what cofactors, what enzyme is not functioning, and what cofactors this child might need. And so a lot of these organic acid tests provide a lot more than just this mitochondrial function. We see markers of gut health, of course, vitamin deficiencies, and sometimes amino acids, oxidative stress, neurotransmitters, detox metabolites. I can't underemphasize how helpful and important this test is. This is some examples. So we'll see an elevated markers of these fatty acids, subearic and sebacic acid. And when they're elevated, we are not metabolizing them well. They're not being used by mitochondria efficiently, and they're spilling into the urine. And that's typically a need for carnitine or riboflavin. Of course, lactic acid and pyruvic acid, I've gone over. The pyruvic acid impaired glucose metabolism, and there's your B1, B2, and B3, thiamine and riboflavin, and ALA, Citric acid being elevated, that's a poorly functioning citrate synthase enzyme, and we know that enzyme is dependent on glutathione and iron. I typically don't give iron alone when I see a citrate synthase. We want to look at for corroborating information. So I'll look at a ferritin, serum iron, TIBC, etc., and try to assess an iron status and only supplement when warranted with iron. And then your succinic acid, of course, will indicate a need for riboflavin CoQ10. Isocitrate dehydrogenase is dependent on vitamin B3, magnesium, manganese, and it's inhibited by aluminum. So, of course, we look into all the ways that we can reduce the aluminum burden. A lot of this, you want to look at the work of Dr. Chris Exley, and silica-rich water is very important here from Dr. Chris Exley. These are some papers showing us the use of organic acid test and urine amino acids in assessing the health of our patients with mitochondrial dysfunction and neurodevelopmental conditions. And I highly recommend you look up these papers if you want to read further on kind of how those work. So what do we do? So treatment, right? When we've assessed that our patient is, our child is experiencing mitochondrial dysfunction, certainly there are protocols out there. And if you can't afford working with a practitioner or these tests, there's some trials that you can do for sure with some of these. Some of them are safer than others. I would say use trials of vitamin B1 and B2 are extremely safe. There are some cofactors involved when using B1 and B2, like magnesium and potassium, but generally they're very safe to use as trials. Flavor is an issue, again, which is where testing is really comes in handy, so that we don't, unnecessarily subject a child to a supplement that doesn't taste very good, to know exactly what they need. So so when we give it to them, we know that we are giving them something that's exactly what they need. So that's why we test, don't guess, running these labs whenever possible. And then always looking for the root cause. Remember my image of the vicious cycle, right? If the nutrient deficiency is found, by all means, you want to, use it and reverse that deficiency. But we've got to be looking at the gut and other factors that are commonly the cause of these nutrient deficiencies. There are some genetics involved, of course, here as well with these enzyme functions, but most often it's more commonly due to these nutrient deficiencies. So what supplements are we considering? Magnesium glycinate. There's also threonate, malate, of course. I like magnesium glycinate. Glycine is a very calming amino acid. Glycinate is very highly absorbable. And in small children, I'll use 100 to 200 milligrams, of course, increasing doses as the child is older. Magnesium sulfate baths, Epsom salts are a very effective way to get more magnesium into the body. You want magnesium sulfate, not magnesium chloride. Thiamine and riboflavin. Now, I separated these out from just a B complex because many B complexes and multivitamins, I would argue, especially for children, are extremely low in vitamin B1 and B2. If you're giving a child a gummy or a chewable vitamin or a powder, they're 99% of them on the market are much too low in B1 and B2 for palatability purposes only, right? They don't taste great. And so they will put them in low levels in these gummies and liquids and powders for children so that the children will at least take it. Now, I would argue if we have a child who has a deficiency in these, then we need to be finding ways to give it. I like mango juice. It's thick and sweet, can be an effective way of giving these B vitamins when warranted. But certainly looking at some B complexes can be warranted in children when they do need multiple B vitamins. Carnitine doses of, upwards of 500, 1,000 milligrams a day of L-carnitine. CoQ10, again, doses of 50 to 100 milligrams for a child are sometimes warranted. Liposomal glutathione, iron bisglycinate, again, when warranted, check your levels first. And alpha lipoic acid, I don't use that a lot. I've seen it cause some reflux in some kids, and it's, again, it's acidic and can be challenging, but when warranted, I will use it in some cases. So these are just supplements to consider, and certainly testing for and using. So what do we see? What papers do we have to show that some of these supplements are helpful? Ubiquinol, this is CoQ10, improved symptoms in children with autism, symptoms of communication, verbal communication, just playing games, engaging, right? Increased engagement, better sleep, lower rates of food rejection with a code. And then they used a blood level of CoQ10, which you can do. You can check blood levels of CoQ10 as well. So improvements with CoQ10. Carnitine, right? Observed total free carnitine values were significantly reduced in patients with autism, and that more than 80% of patients have total and free carnitine levels below the reference value. So certainly addressing a carnitine deficiency, often secondary to malabsorption, really important for gut motility and muscle tone, overall mitochondrial function. This is a paper by Dr. Derek Lonsdale. He is, I would say, a hero of mine. If you look up any work by Dr. Derek Lonsdale, I highly recommend that. A lot of his work is published on a website called hormonesmatter.com, hormonesmatter.com. Dr. Derek Lonsdale's work is there. He's written a lot about thiamine, magnesium, potassium, folate, etc. And here he gave TTFD, a form of thiamine, to a group of 10 children with autism, but observed in 8 of them, many of them improved clinically, noting in particular they had higher levels of arsenic, which is a known inhibitor of thiamine. So lots to tease out there. I do have a video on YouTube also on thiamine deficiency in children with special needs if you want more detail there. Okay, so this is, again, we're looking at expected outcomes. It was a 6-month-old with Down syndrome. I do often treat very young patients with Down syndrome. Parents reach out to me, and we see the same patterns in our patients with Down syndrome as we do with autism: mitochondrial dysfunction, gut motility issues, low muscle tone, nutrient deficiencies, etc. And you can see this child, 6 months old, had a high pyruvic acid, resulting in a high lactic acid. So this child had switched over to lactic acid fermentation. And that lactic acid, that's the same lactic acid you or I would experience if we had a hard workout or a long day in the garden and our muscles were sore the next day. And this child is trying to grow and develop, and their brain, unfortunately, was, I would say, literally starving of energy, because then we look at the other mitochondrial markers of the Krebs cycle, also known as the citric acid cycle, and we see multiple elevations here indicating that that cycle was not functioning efficiently as well. These are the follow-up results, right? And I'll tell you what I did for this child. I gave him thiamine and riboflavin. About 6 to 8 months later, let's see, July to January, this child's lactic acid, pyruvic acid improved. Their Krebs cycle markers improved. Succinic acid still needed a little bit of work, but significant improvements from their previous results, if you can see that. Really high elevations there, and then normalized there. And this is a child with Down syndrome that everyone just expects poor development, poor neurodevelopment, poor, delayed gross motor skills, when really it was actionable. We can take action on this, right? So what did I use? I didn't use a lot. This was a very young child. I didn't share all of his results, but we did use some antimicrobial herbs because these deficiencies were secondary to and causing slow gut motility, resulting in yeast and bacterial overgrowth in his GI tract. So we used some gentle antimicrobial herbs to clear his GI tract of those elevated levels of bacteria and yeast to optimize absorption of the nutrients we gave, which were thiamine and riboflavin, carnitine for gut motility because he also had elevated fatty acids, some CoQ10, and then liposomal glutathione for some antioxidant support. So that's all we gave this child. And he developed beautifully. His first appointment, he still had a head lag that should be gone, around 3 to 4 months. I encourage you to look up what a head lag is. When you pick up a child, when they're laying face up, their head will kind of lag behind. They won't have strength in their neck. He wasn't even kicking when he was prone on his belly, couldn't lift his head up for very long, and had very, very low muscle tone at 6 months old. And of course, I, doing what I do, didn't accept that was, just Down syndrome, and we ran our tests and improved things for him. And so I just included a few notes from his follow-up appointments that we saw him for a couple of years. And by 2, he was walking independently, running upstairs, nice and strong. And the key here is we got in super early at 6 months old. That's incredibly early. I often don't have that opportunity with children, but it's one of my final tips for you, is to diagnose and treat as early as possible. As soon as you see clues in your child that they may need this kind of support, if you get dismissed by your pediatrician, please know that they don't always understand mitochondrial dysfunction, conventional pediatrics. They have an important role in your child's health, of course, but I encourage you to work with a practitioner if you can, who can run these labs when necessary: a functional medical doctor, a naturopathic physician, a MAPS physician. The very basic, avoiding refined sugars and white grains, because they are devoid of the B vitamins. The more glucose that we give our body without the B vitamins to metabolize them, we will deplete our B vitamins because trying to be used to metabolize that refined sugar. So definitely avoiding those in your patients. And then always, always working to optimize gut health, because it's the foundation for the health of the rest of the body. I hope you found this presentation helpful. I know I'll be sharing this with a lot of my patients to explain the work that I do with them. Please reach out if you'd like some support personally from us at the Peirson Center. We have also who works with us, Dr. Valerie LaRosa, who is remarkably experienced and knows all this stuff that I do as well. Reach out if you need any help, and I hope you found this helpful for your child. So thank you so much for your attention.